Hi, everyone. I'm Shilpa Hegde Ingram. Thank you for joining today's final pre-election briefing with TargetSmart Senior Advisor, Tom Bonyer. We'll start off with a short presentation from Tom, and then you'll be able to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. And with that, I will hand it over to Tom. Thank you.
Thank you, Shilpa. Thanks everyone for coming. It's great to see so many folks here. Understand the enthusiasm as we're here on the eve of election day. So, as Shilpa said, I'll have a handful of slides to go through. The presentation will be relatively brief, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. I want to set a little framework before I jump into the slides and the analysis. So, we're here on the eve of the election. We've seen a lot of votes cast so far. For those of you who have followed our analysis, not just over this year, but over previous cycles, you know that we're big believers in the power of early vote analysis, new voter registration analysis. We've been sharing these insights over the last, few weeks in these briefings, several months over the course of this cycle, basically in perpetuity. Where we stand now, I think everyone's well aware, as you've seen all the polls sort of gravitate towards the center. All of the different polling averages seem to be showing this 50-50. And, the question, to state the obvious, is about turnout and which side has more intensity and enthusiasm. And that's where the early vote analysis can give us a good sense of to what extent the polls are missing some of this. And provide that additional context about specific groups. So with that, Sean, if you don't mind sharing the slides, we'll jump into the analysis. Okay. So the first slide here, you're going to see something that I don't think anyone will find surprising, but this is looking at the total early votes cast as of this point in the election, which is, a day out. Keep in mind this lags by about a day because we're collecting the data effectively in real time from every state in the District of Columbia. And so what you see at this point in the 2020 cycle, just over 90 million votes have been cast. In the end, the total early turnout in 2020 was over 100 million votes, keeping in mind that some mail votes come in after Election Day in some states. And some come in actually on election day that are dropped in drop boxes and that sort of thing. About 2/3 of all votes in 2020 were cast before election day. When I say this isn't surprising, if you look at the total early vote now, it's about 78 million votes that have been cast across the country. That is obviously a reduction in turnout. It's about 13%. Again, these are national numbers. Now, that isn't to suggest that turnout overall is likely to be down. If we think of the context of the 2020 election, and I'm not going to remind everyone in great detail about the pandemic, we all lived through it, but we know what an impact that had on voter turnout, especially early vote turnout. We saw the greatest expansion of voting access that this country has seen in generations as states pivoted to allow people to vote safely during a deadly pandemic. You saw an asymmetry in terms of who was voting early, and we'll get into that in a moment. But we also knew that as we emerged from the pandemic, that voters would begin to return to their pre-pandemic voting behavior to some extent. And the reason I say to some extent that's important is we know that many of the states that actually had very restrictive early and mail voting laws prior to the pandemic maintained their expansion. Pennsylvania is a great example of this, a state where only about 200,000 people cast a ballot before Election Day in 2016, and that was multiplied by a factor of about 10 going into 2020. And we're seeing high turnout this time around in Pennsylvania and elsewhere. So it's not that we're reverting entirely to pre-pandemic voting patterns. We're going to something that doesn't have a perfect precedent. But I do want to highlight and come back to this slide and just sort of keep this in the back of everyone's mind that when we talk about groups dropping off in turnout, well, realistically, just about, and I'll give you some caveats, but just about every group is dropping off relative to 2020 for these obvious reasons. Okay, we can go to the next slide, Sean. So the question then becomes, which groups are shifting more from early voting to election day? And are there any groups that are shifting from election day to early when we think about the 2020 to 2024 uh, comparison between the early vote? Because again, that's our best benchmark for comparing the current early vote, but it's a very imperfect benchmark. So we need to spend some time to understand what the likely vote shifting is, because you have these different dynamics. As I said, you have those overwhelmingly. If you'd have that 13% drop off in total early vote turnout, that means we're talking about many millions, actually tens of millions of voters in the end, once all of these are counted, likely, who are shifting from early voting to election day voting. And we know that some people are doing the opposite. So, more on that in a second. But this is looking at some good polling data from 4 years ago and from right now. This is from Marist, but this is reflected and echoed, frankly, across the polls. And what I highlighted here is on top, you'll see 2020. You look at all the different vote modes here, but I want to highlight the in person on election day. And again, this is something that was predicted in this poll a few weeks before election day in 2020, but then the results held true to this. You see that 26% of Democrats said that they would be voting on election day, as compared to 63% of Republicans. Now, we have to remember that was a massive shift from pre pandemic early voting patterns, where frankly, Republicans tended to dominate the voting before election day, especially in mail balloting. Uh, we recall that Donald Trump told his supporters in 2020 that voting by mail was some sort of fraud. He complained about the notion of early voting in general, saying that it shouldn't be an election month, it should be an election day. And that had a serious impact. It was the absolute lowest point for Republican early voting in any election in recent history. It was a low water mark. Whereas for Democrats, it was an absolute domination of early voting, as Democrats were more COVID conscious and just flocked to voting before election day. So, how has that changed in the last 4 years? Well, we're seeing that in the data now, but I want to show you why we anticipated what we're seeing, frankly, anticipated something more dramatic than what we're seeing based on this same polling data. You look at the shift. So, again, in 2020, the expectation, it was a plus 37 Republican advantage in terms of the election day voting, 63% of Republicans, 26% Democrats. Now look at the bottom with 2024. That goes down to an 11-point advantage. So it's still suggesting that election day should skew somewhat more Republican, and therefore the early vote should skew somewhat more Democratic, but the polarization is much less. Now, if you do the basic math on that, based on what voters have told us about their intent in this polling, you would expect to see a fairly substantial shift towards Republicans in the early voting. Well, I'm going to jump into some of the stats here, but I'm going to spoil the surprise too. We haven't seen that. In fact, we're seeing an electorate that looks much more like the 2020 early vote than I think any analyst predicted. You are seeing small shifts, but nothing along the lines of what this polling data and what other polling data, and frankly, what analysts would predict. So let's jump in. We can go to the next slide. Okay. So this is looking at demographically from a gender perspective. We know, obviously, that the gender gap has become even more pronounced post Dobbs, but there have been open questions about how that would impact a presidential election. Again, if your belief is that you would see this massive shift of more Republicans shifting from early to election day, more Democrats shifting, more Democrats shifting early to election day and more Republicans doing the opposite, we should see substantially reduced gender gaps. And as you see across the battleground states, you're not seeing that. So what this chart is showing you is what percent of the early electorate to date is women. And so across the battlegrounds, you're only seeing a 0.2 of a point reduction in share. And when you go across these states, you see really minimal reductions. And in fact, The biggest reductions, and frankly, in some states, actually increases. North Carolina, I'd like to call out, where women are now accounting for a larger share of the early vote than they did at this point in 2020. Again, something that's shocking. In Georgia, women matching a huge gender gap from 2020, 56.1%. So that's a 12.2 point gender gap. States that have the bigger drop offs, I'll call out Michigan, and keep in mind, this is zoomed in. So that's only an 0.8 of a point drop off in gender gap. We're still talking about a 10.6 point gender gap in 2020. But we have to remember, vote mode is important here. Michigan added early in person voting this year. That's something that's been going on there for about the last week or so, a little bit more than that. We know that early in person voting is something that is more favored by Republicans than mail voting. Before, Michigan was almost entirely mail. And so by bringing more Republicans in just from a vote mode shift, that's something that's relevant to our Pennsylvania analysis as well. You see the gender gap coming down. But again, it's 0.8 of a point. You've seen massive gender gaps persist where the electorate still, at least in this regard, looks very much like it did in 2020. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is actually looking at younger women. One of the theories of the case of the Trump campaign is that they will appeal to younger men. We've seen this sort of Joe Rogan UFC strategy. One of the risks of that strategy, or one of the challenges perhaps of that strategy, is that we know that younger men are among, if not the lowest propensity groups out there in terms of a turnout perspective. But again, we've been hearing for quite some time about their investment in that. We've been seeing the media strategy to that effect. And so an interesting question is, are we seeing that? We know that younger women who are much more activated and mobilized since the Dobbs decision also say in the polls that they're much more likely to vote on election day. So we weren't anticipating to see gender gaps coming close to 2020 among younger voters in terms of higher women turnout. But what you see, again, in the battlegrounds, younger voters are actually showing us a bigger gender gap. Women are accounting for a larger share in aggregate of the early vote across the battleground states. And when you look at, where that's happening, driven by Pennsylvania, where you've got a bigger gender gap, again, North Carolina, Georgia running almost even again. And in fact, in no state do you really see substantial drop-offs in the gender gap among younger voters. So to the extent that the Trump campaign is banking on a flood of younger men to come out to change the electorate in a favorable way relative to 2020, all we can say at this point is, as we approach the end, or really at the end of the early vote process, it hasn't shown up yet. Okay, we can go to the next slide. This is looking at partisanship. So we've looked at some of the demographics here underlined from the perspective of gender. We'll get into some other demographics, and I'm happy to answer questions along the way about anything we didn't cover in terms of different demographic groups. But this is looking at modeled partisanship across all of the battleground states, comparing 2020, 2024. So you'll see on the far right side, what this is showing you is that the modeled partisan advantage, and again, don't think of this as a prediction of candidate support or candidate margins. Think of it as a proxy for partisan registration. It's party identification. We've seen from the public polling that Vice President Harris seems to be outperforming these modeled partisanship numbers by pretty significant margins. But this gives us a good apples to apples comparison across these states and across cycles. And so what you see is a modeled Democratic advantage of 1.8 points right now across all of the battlegrounds. Compare that to a 1.9 point Democratic advantage at this point in the early vote 4 years ago. So I want to be clear about that. What that's showing is a 1/10 of a point shift towards Republicans in aggregate across the battleground states. So again, as we think about what Republicans have been telling us in terms of their investment in the early vote, and which I think, by the way, is a very real thing. We have seen them pushing it much more. Donald Trump has been much more on message. They talk about it at all of their rallies. They outsourced some of this to Elon Musk and have spent significant resources. What we can say at this point, when you look across the battleground states, is that there is almost immeasurable difference between 2020 and 2024 in terms of partisanship. When you look across the states, you see slightly bigger differences. But again, in some cases, Arizona is better for Democrats at this point, at least in terms of partisan model. Georgia is better for Democrats. Michigan is better for Democrats. North Carolina, you look at just a 2.2% difference. Nevada, a 4.2% difference. Pennsylvania is one that jumps out with the biggest difference. And I'll talk about that more in a second. It's actually a pretty obvious answer that I've talked about a bit, but we can jump into it. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. So this is looking at the same sort of frame, but this is just looking at early voters who are older. In this case, age 75 plus. It's one of the categories. It's the oldest age category on Target Early. This is something that we've just sort of begun to dig into over the last few days. For lack of a better term, I've been referring to this as a silver surge. This was surprising to me. And it also shows how some of these broader demographic categories can be misleading, meaning if we looked at the electorate, and a lot of these states will see that it's older than it was 4 years ago in the early vote. And I think generically we would look at that and say, well, that's good for Republicans. Well, it matters which types of older voters are coming out at a higher rate. And as you can see from the data here, you have significantly higher turnout or significantly larger composition of this early vote among older Democratic voters. A lot of this is being driven by older Democratic women, but not exclusively. So in the battleground states, we see the modeled Republican advantage has been cut in half in the early vote, 2024 relative to 2020. In Wisconsin, you see a massive difference there, a almost 28-point swing. But again, in all of these states, almost all of these states, you see the senior electorate is actually not only more Democratic, but substantially more Democratic than it was at this point 4 years ago. Okay, next slide. We only have a couple more here. I mentioned Pennsylvania, but in general, a big question that we have to ask ourselves when we're thinking about early vote analysis, I've talked about partisanship, I've talked about demographics, but really, who is winning in the early vote isn't really that interesting from an analytic standpoint. It's certainly not the questions that we're trying to answer as we sit on the eve of election day. What we're trying to learn from the early vote data is what I said at the outset. Which party has signs of intensity and enthusiasm advantages? And the way we look at that are the types of voters that are voting early. If one party is surging in the early vote, but they're doing so by bringing in people who are going to vote on election day anyhow, while that might have some sort of tactical advantage for that party, it's not an indicator of any sort of enthusiasm advantage. It's just a tactical shift. And if we keep in mind that, again, 2020 represented the absolute low watermark for Republican enthusiasm and participation in early voting, and an absolute high watermark for Democrats due to the pandemic. And we've seen everything in the polling that I've shared with you and everything else that shows that anticipated shift. The question always was, would Republicans be able to bring more low propensity new voters into the process? We know that they lost the popular vote by about 7 million votes 4 years ago. We know that their strategy has been to bring in new voters. And so this is really the test of it here. And what this is showing is looking at what percent of the voters who voted early among each party voted on election day in 2020. That's the cannibalization. Are you taking 2020 election day voters and thus shifting them to vote a week or a few days earlier than they did last time? And so this is the ratio that you're seeing. So the higher the number, basically the bigger the ratio between Republican election day voters and Democratic election day voters. The first thing that you'll see, there is no state among the battlegrounds where Democrats have a higher proportion of election day voters that they are converting to early. Number one, not even close. Pennsylvania stands out where it is almost a 3-to-1 ratio of Republican share election day voters. We're talking about just under 50% of registered Republicans who have voted in Pennsylvania so far voted on election day 4 years ago. Another 43% of Republicans who have voted so far voted by mail last time. So they're just reverting to the same behavior as last time. So again, Pennsylvania stands out. Michigan right behind. Those are two states that are the most mail heavy. So what we're seeing again is Republican tactics play out. They took a lot of people who voted on election day last time and convinced them to take a mail ballot. Again, I guess that's helpful from a campaign's perspective slightly, but in terms of that indicating enthusiasm, it's not there. So for the last frame of analysis, and then again, I'm happy to take questions. We have to, and we can go to the next slide, Sean. We have to ask ourselves, what about new registrants? We've heard Republicans talking a lot about how they've invested in voter registration over the last 4 years since they lost the last election. Really, I think if they acknowledge two errors from 2020, one was a failure to invest in early voting, two was the need to be able to change the electorate in a way that was favorable to them. And so we've heard analyses about how they've registered so many voters in places like Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Arizona, Nevada. And certainly we've been sharing voter registration analyses over the last couple of weeks for those of you who've joined these briefings, and the last several months as we've continued to track voter registration. And you've seen that actually Democrats have out-registered Republicans in most of these battleground states since Vice President Harris became the nominee, in some cases going back over the past year. But we still need to test this case because, again, if Republicans are going to win through new registration and these younger men voters, you would expect to see it emerging in the early vote. Well, I'll fast forward and tell you that you're not seeing it in the early vote. This is showing the model Democratic advantage among early voters, people who have cast a ballot already, who didn't vote in 2020 because they weren't registered to vote. So these are all the people who have registered since 2020. Again, this is a group that Republicans have told us for months, if not years now, that they were winning this battle. Well, across the battlegrounds, the model Democratic advantage is 7.8 points. Now, again, if you think back to a few slides ago, the model Democratic advantage among all early voters across these states was only just under 2 points. So what you're seeing is a much bigger advantage among these new registrants. You look at Pennsylvania, again, which I think Republicans have been saying is their shining star in terms of where they've done so well in the early vote. Well, actually, and new voter registration, what we're seeing in the data here is a 35-point Democratic advantage among Pennsylvanians who have voted already, who registered since 2020. Across all these states, you see a significant advantage, except Michigan. Michigan, we have to remember, is a state that put automatic voter registration in place some time ago. You don't see nearly as many new registrations there, perhaps because of that. But again, when you look at these margins across the battleground states, you see pretty substantial Democratic margins across all of them. Okay, I'm going to take a breath, and then I would be happy to take questions.
Thanks, Tom. First up, one point you brought up this past weekend was the silver surge. The early vote data shows this in swing states. What I found interesting was this is also reflected in the Seltzer poll in Iowa, where we are seeing 65 plus women swing heavily toward Harris. Can we drill into Florida? Anecdotally, I feel like this state swings older, and if you compound that with the large Puerto Rican population, I feel like this state has the propensity to flip blue.
Yeah, thanks for that question. There's a lot in there, but I'm going to try to be as quick as possible with all these questions so we can get to as many as possible. So the mention of the Seltzer poll, I think that's an important flag. And again, we have to keep in mind that's only one poll. I'm not going to talk about, if someone else wants to ask a question about my thoughts on that poll in general, I'm happy to get into it, but I know that wasn't the question. But what they flagged is important, is that when you look at the analysis of that poll and you look at the crosstabs, what they're telling us was driving a lot of that movement to Vice President Harris between their previous poll that showed a better environment for Donald Trump in this poll that showed a 3-point Harris lead, was a lot of movement from older voters, especially older women. And so, again, on one hand, we have the caveat that this is only one poll. On the other hand, we have the truth that what is driving the movement in the poll is what has been emerging in the early vote data, has also actually been emerging in the voter registration data, which is interesting because generally when we think about voter registration, we think about younger voters, and that's certainly the case. But you have been seeing more Democratic women above the age of 65 registering to vote. So there's clearly something going on there and some mobilization there that perhaps hasn't been reflected in the polling. It's impossible to say without being able to see under the hood of every single poll sample. That does appear to be the case. In terms of Florida, yes, there's a bigger senior population. I haven't dug in as deep on the Florida early vote data in terms of looking at to what extent we're seeing a senior surge, a silver surge there as well. But they mentioned Puerto Rican voters as well. We know that just on our file alone, our team has identified over 600,000 registered voters, Puerto Rican registered voters in Florida. So to the extent that we believe, and again, there's polling data. I saw this from Equis today. I've seen other polls to this effect in the last few days that suggested that they are being mobilized and persuaded by this moment and the racist comments from the MSG rally. There certainly is the potential for the vote to shift more there towards Democrats than anticipated.
Next up, what was the gender composition of the electorate, men versus women, in blue wall states in 2020? How does that compare to current known vote? And what number would you be looking for to see a Harris win?
Yeah, I mean, great question. Those are very specific, and so I'm happy to. I always hate to speculate or guess in terms of my recollection when I could click a few buttons and give you the actual answer. But in terms of the breakdown from early vote, we do know that the early vote, as you saw on that earlier slide, is substantially more women. Generally in these states between 54 and 56% women. When you look at the overall electorate, it tends to be somewhere between 51 and 52% in most of those states. Georgia higher, Nevada lower, but generally in that range. And again, we have the specific, you can go to targetearly.targetsmart.com and you can actually click a button there that allows you to look at the final electorate. There's 3 buttons in the top right to look at the early vote compared to this same time point, which is a day out. The final all votes in early vote, and then the final all votes in, including election day vote. So you can look at the gender gaps there. And again, in terms of where Democrats need to be, it's impossible to answer that with specificity because there are so many other factors. But what we have seen since Dobbs is that women are more engaged. And it's sort of this engagement among younger voters turning out at unprecedented rates in some of these midterm elections. And then also what we've been talking about here, older voters, older women turning out at higher rates. So I think that has the potential to see the gender gaps grow in these states. I think what that also means when you think about the polling that I shared, those Marist polls, and showing a much narrower gap in terms of partisanship, is election day in 2020 was dominated by men voting because Democrats and women were voting overwhelmingly older. There is the potential to see a much more balanced election day vote. And again, like I said, we know that young women have been mobilized by Dobbs, and overwhelmingly young women are telling us that they're more likely to vote on election day. So, to the extent that anyone is looking for any surprises in the data, I think that's something to watch for.
Next up, the Trump campaign today put out a memo utilizing TargetSmart data to argue in favor of a so-called Democratic turnout problem, highlighting specifically the fact that female and urban turnout appears down versus 2020 numbers, while rural turnout is up. Any thoughts on that argument?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go point by point with that memo. I actually haven't even read the entire memo, but I've glanced at it. But there are some fallacies just on the surface level, like I said, and they talk about turnout among women being down. Well, again, turnout among women and men is down. All turnout is down 13%. So they just picked, apparently Democratic groups and said that they were down. In reality, as you saw in the data I shared here in terms of the gender gaps are almost perfectly replicating the massive historic gender gaps from 2020 and that electorate that ended up being very unfavorable to Republicans, even though we know, as I've been saying again and again, Democratic voters are much more likely to vote on election day this year relative to 2020. And in some of these states, like North Carolina, Women are actually accounting for a larger share of the early vote. In Georgia, they're matching that 56.1% share. And again, everywhere else they're hanging right there within a few tenths of a percent. So that's just simply false. What I saw in that memo was something that seemed to be going to great lengths to twist numbers from a distance to appear good for them. I'll leave you all to draw your own conclusions as to why they might be doing that at this point in the campaign. It doesn't strike me as particularly confident or optimistic type of analysis at this point, just before Election Day.
Next up, are there notable turnout differences between Republicans and Democrats across age groups?
Yeah. So when you look at the partisan break, again, that was sort of reflected into gender gaps among younger voters. But in general, you are seeing at the ends that younger Democrats and older Democrats seem to be more mobilized than their counterparts, than younger Republicans or older Republicans. So those are the biggest differentials. Again, we don't want to read too much into this, because Election Day, to the extent that Election Day is always decisive, in 2020 it was about a third of votes cast on Election Day. This year it'll be close to 50, maybe 45 to 47% of votes will be cast on Election Day. So this could all change, but that's what we're seeing in the early vote at this point.
Next up, how much of an early red mirage, late blue shift are you anticipating as results roll in and mail-in ballots get counted? Still notable or not as much as in 2020?
Yeah, incredibly important question. For those who don't recall that sort of nomenclature, the red mirage was this, I think, caution prior to the 2020 election that as the results were counted, and anticipating that the early vote, especially the vote by mail, which again, as we've been talking about, was overwhelmingly favorable to Democrats, that would take longer to count. So what you would see on election night is the early count showing very favorable Republican results. And then as the night went on, or frankly, as days went on, the Democratic early vote numbers would come in and chip away at that, and then eventually surpass that. And that it really is what transpired in most of those states where it was predicted. It will be different this time around. Ideally, it will be substantially better. We can't predict what will happen. We know that some states, Michigan, let's give them credit, with a Democratic governor, Democratic legislature, and a Democratic Secretary of State, they acted after 2020 and put legislation in place that allows localities, I believe, that are bigger than 5,000 people to count their mail ballots before Election Day. I think they started last week. They should be in good shape. But there's still places like Pennsylvania where, as I understand it, they can't start counting those mail ballots until tomorrow morning. I understand that they have some systems that will allow them to count faster, but we know, again, when you look at, even though Republicans have made gains in the vote share among the mail ballots in Pennsylvania, it is still overwhelmingly Democratic voters coming out. So when those votes are counted and reported, could not be more important. And so, I guess the best blanket advice I could give to anyone here is we need to be patient, and we need to make sure that the information we are reporting on is accurate and complete. Oftentimes we hear bad information about what types of votes and how many are still out and waiting to be counted, where they are from. We have lots of great data, obviously the data you've seen here, the data that's on our Target Early site, about what we can expect from the early vote. But I just urge people, unless you have access to the type of data that we have access to not be drawing those types of conclusions.
Next up, do you anticipate any surprises in red states like Texas, Florida, Iowa for Democrats, both Congress and presidential?
So we always have to anticipate surprises, but the nature of surprises is we can't anticipate where. But in every election, there's some number of surprises. We saw that in 2022 with Lauren Boebert and some other races, and the Boebert race being incredibly close, obviously, even though she pulled it out by the narrowest of margins. We saw some surprising Democratic wins elsewhere. There will be surprises. I can't predict where. Mention Texas, Iowa, Florida, Kansas, wherever. Anything is possible at this point. There have been incredibly favorable early vote numbers in these places, in Texas. We've seen, again, we've talked about the Seltzer poll. The impact of Dobbs can't be it's impossible to overemphasize and overestimate it. We haven't seen how it will impact a presidential election. We don't know to what extent that is baked into the polls at this point, but we have seen the Democratic candidates since Dobbs have fairly consistently outperformed polls. So what that means is we could see a pretty significant number of surprises on election night.
Next up, would love your view on if there's anything we can conclude among voters who didn't vote in 2020, in particular in North Carolina and Georgia. In North Carolina, this is 24% of the independent vote so far. In Georgia, this total number across all voters is north of 800,000, 30% of African Americans. Do we know anything about these groups in terms of where they are, urban, suburban, age, et cetera?
So we do. I mean, that's all on the Target Early site, and I encourage people to dig in if you need something to do tonight. Uh, while you're waiting for election day to roll around tomorrow, you can dig into Target Early. In the end, there's sort of two different universes that we're talking about. There's these lower propensity non 2020 voters uh, who I highlighted in that last slide that were not registered to vote. And we saw how Democrats are really performing incredibly well in the early vote with those voters. There's this other group that I think you've seen some Republican analyses highlight, which is the infrequent voters. So they were registered to vote in 2020, but they didn't vote last time around. Maybe they voted in 2022, maybe they didn't, but these are the more sporadic voters. There are fewer of them in the early vote. And that group does lean slightly more Republican. There's a reason for that. When you think about 2020, again, Democrats won the popular vote by a fairly substantial margin in 2020, meaning just by nature, by logic, those who didn't vote are going to be slightly more Republican. And so you're seeing that. The question referred to unaffiliated voters in North Carolina, or the fact that these voters they lean more unaffiliated. We do know that younger voters in general, especially when you look at the last year in these key states, especially through the party registration Sunbelt states, so North Carolina, Arizona, Nevada, you can throw Pennsylvania in there to some extent as the other party registration battleground state. We've seen a huge increase in new registered voters registering unaffiliated, and we know that they are younger and more likely to be voters of color. We know from the polling that these are voters that also tend to vote overwhelmingly for Democratic candidates. But again, you can dig in on Target Early and you can see some of the modeled partisanship and demographics of these groups.
Next up, can you talk a bit about the Seltzer poll?
Yeah, sure. I guess I said I would do that. So I'll give a quick level of analysis on this. And by the way, I should also give a pitch. My friend Simon Rosenberg, for those of you who don't follow him on Opium Chronicles, I suggest you check out his analysis on early vote and also on polls. He digs a lot more into these polls than I, and does a great job with it. But the Seltzer poll, for folks who have been asleep for the last couple of days, showed Vice President Harris leading by 3 points in Iowa. I think a shocker for a lot of people. The Seltzer poll is one of the most historically accurate polls out there. They're incredibly well respected for good reason. They do a great job. It is one poll. And so, again, we have to be careful about over calibrating to a single poll. I guess the way I look at it, though, is that Donald Trump won Iowa by, I think, a little over 8 points, a little over an 8-point margin in 2020. So we're talking about an 11-point margin differential here. And so if this poll is off by 4 or 5 points, which would be a pretty big miss in terms of what Seltzer normally does, it would still be incredibly bad news for Republicans at this point. If it's a 6 or 7-point miss, it still means having the margin in Iowa from an 8-point loss to a 4-point loss. If Democrats are trailing by only 4 points statewide in Iowa, that bodes incredibly well for the Harris campaign. Again, I can't say that's exactly what's going to happen. It is a single poll, but I think there's a reason that it's gotten the amount of attention that it has gotten. And that's due to their track record, their accuracy, and just how dramatically out of line it is with what happened there in 2020.
Next up, what are we seeing on the AAPI vote? We know it was critical last time.
Yeah, so this is incredibly important. So in 2020, Asian American voters played. I can't overemphasize how important Asian American voters were in what happened in 2020, especially when you look at the Sun Belt states, you look at the narrow margins of victory in places like Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. That's not to say that they weren't important elsewhere, but you had such narrow margins there. I first started talking about this 4 years ago in mid October when I was seeing the Asian American voters in the early vote in Georgia had already voted at a higher rate than they had in the entirety of the 2016 election, including the election day vote, which is just something that still to this day seems amazing to me. But what that, and again, this is to the point of this entire conversation, that surge of Asian American turnout in Georgia and then eventually in Texas and then Arizona and Nevada and Pennsylvania and elsewhere was predictive in the end of massive increases in Asian American turnout on election day as well, where they became the margin of victory in all of these close states. Uh, and so, what are we seeing in the early vote now? I just noticed this, I think, yesterday, where total Asian American turnout, the number of Asian Americans who have voted in Georgia, just surpassed their total early vote turnout in Georgia from 2020. Again, I mean, sit with that for a minute because what they did in 2020 was incredible. And we're seeing numbers that are surpassing that already. A lot of this is being driven by Asian American voters over the age of 50, but not exclusively. Again, we know that the younger Asian American voters are telling us they're more likely to vote on election day. So, again, if we're looking for something that could be driving some surprise results on election day, to me, that will be a big question to pay attention to is looking at younger Asian American voters. We know in Georgia, especially the very diverse suburbs outside of Atlanta, where you have huge concentrations of Asian American voters, but not limited to there, really, again, throughout the battleground states. So I think that's something that's been a bit underreported on, and I would recommend paying closer attention to.
Next up, and I think we have time for just a couple more. What will you be watching for on election night?
Yeah, I mean, beyond the things I've already covered, I alluded to in the question in Florida around Puerto Rican turnout and persuasion. Pennsylvania, our team identified over 300,000 registered voters there. There's potential for significant impact as well. Beyond that, on election night, as the results begin to come in, because from the early vote data we'll have the ability for those states that actually break out the early voting, those states that actually do count it early. And so when polls close, they'll be dropping the early vote candidate vote totals, in some cases, very soon after polls close. That will give us a very early sign that if either candidate is outperforming the modeled partisanship by any substantial margin, again, I think that'll be a good early sign for that campaign. Like I alluded to a moment ago, we have seen fairly consistently in the public polls, most recently the New York Times Siena state polls that were released over the weekend, when they break out the early vote, people who have already voted, we can compare that head to head to what we know about the partisanship of those people who've already voted. We continue to see Vice President Harris overperforming with these voters. That's a good early sign. Again, that is in no way indicative that anyone's running away with this or anything else. It is one good early sign that I'll be looking for potential confirmation or denial of in some of the early election results after polls close.
And finally, is there anything in the early voting that shows more enthusiasm or less amongst African Americans and Hispanics?
Yeah, great and important question. So, when we look at the early vote data, North Carolina is one where this question has come up more because Georgia as well, perhaps, because when we've looked at the early vote, we've seen African American voters accounting for a slightly smaller share of the early vote than they did 4 years ago. We actually have those Marist poll numbers that I showed for the country. We have them at the state level as well. In North Carolina, it showed that 38% of African American voters said they were going to vote on election day as compared to 26% of white voters. it actually allows you to do some pretty basic math where if you apply that to the early vote, that would predict that African American voters will actually account for a slightly larger share of the electorate in the state than they did 4 years ago. The other thing to consider in some of these states, and again, North Carolina, Georgia are good examples of this, but you can throw Arizona and Nevada in there as well. As I mentioned before, Asian American voters are the fastest growing group in the country. Hispanic voters are not far behind. So you're seeing big growth from those groups in these Sun Belt states. And so, to the extent that in some of the early vote, you're seeing African American voters account for a somewhat smaller share of the early vote, part of that is just offset because of the growth of these other groups, which are also significantly Democratic groups. So, just something important to keep in mind.
Thanks, Tom, and thanks everyone for joining. I think that's all the time we have. So stay tuned for additional insights, and we will see everyone post-election day.
Thank you.